Thanks for joining us on our streaming service for your First Alert Avalanche Report. I'm your First Alert meteorologist, Callie Zanandri, and joining me is the Deputy Director of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, Brian Lazar. Brian, we've had some warm weather. How's that looking for the snowpack?
Not great. We're probably a good month ahead of schedule for our normal kind of seasonal melt. And if you just look around at kind of particularly elevations below about 10,000 feet out there in the mountains, it's pretty obvious to the naked eye. But in terms of the data, I'll just give you a snapshot of what our snowpack looks around the state. And as of today, we're actually dropped just a little bit below 70% of long-term medium for the snowpack. A little bit better conditions in the northern mountains, but you can see the southern mountains are down into the 40-45 percentile. So without some more moisture, it's going to be, pretty dry, pretty quick down there in the southern mountains.
Now, with the snow that is left, how are conditions shaping up in the backcountry?
Well, that's the silver lining here, is that the conditions are generally safe. So, which means most slopes are safe from avalanches. You can see we're at low danger statewide as we move into the last part of the work week here and into the weekend. And the reason is, I can show you this temperature profile. If you look at the red line in the upper graph, this is just for a random point in the Elk Mountains, central part of the state at 11,000 feet, but it's really illustrative of what's going on essentially across the state. And you can see here as we move into the latter part of the work week, we're still getting temperatures, high temperatures during the day, peaking out in the low to mid 40s. But those nighttime temperatures are dropping down into the 20s, which is allowing for pretty good freeze. And this lower graph shows the cloud cover, which also shows that not only are temperatures dropping into the low 20s, but we're also doing that under mostly clear skies. And that allows for radiational cooling. And all of that means is we're getting good, solid freezes overnight. And that's why the threat from wet avalanche activity is not as big as a concern as it was, in some previous really warm weeks. That's allowing for this low danger and generally safe conditions.
Now, even though conditions are generally safe, like you mentioned, it doesn't mean they're non-existent.
Yeah, so low danger means avalanches are unlikely, and if they do run, they're mostly going to be small. But that does not mean avalanches are impossible, and it doesn't mean you can't get yourself into trouble. And we have some really good examples from just the last several days. This is an example of a skier who triggered a small, loose, wet avalanche on Buffalo Mountain outside of Silverthorne in the Silver Couloir. And you can see here that this small avalanche swept this skier off of his feet and started to move him downhill. And so you'll see here he puts in a small little ski cut, releases some of this wet snow, which then knocks him off his feet. So again, a pretty small avalanche, but this is in fairly steep, consequential terrain. You can see how hard a time he is extricating himself from that moving debris. And had he been in a slightly steeper slope, he could have certainly taken a larger ride, or he could have hit rocks or other obstacles on the way down. Fortunately, this incident didn't result in any injury, but it is a good example of how small avalanches can be really serious in very steep terrain. Couple other examples. This was an avalanche triggered by a skier right after our most recent snowfall. A small wind slab avalanche on Grizzly Peak outside of Loveland Pass washed this skier down this slope into these rocky features, resulted in a lower leg injury requiring a flight for life evacuation. And one last example of a small wind slab avalanche near the ridgeline here, which swept a skier down this slope near Berthoud Pass. Again, this skier was able to arrest on the bed surface, but you could see how he easily could have been washed into some of these rocks. And so again, the message right now is most slopes are safe from avalanche. Great time to get out there and recreate. It's common for people to push into more serious, more consequential terrain as we get into the spring, but small avalanches can have really bad consequences.
Now, early next week, we are expecting a spring storm to push into the region, bringing another 5 to 10 inches of fresh snow. How will that change conditions?
Yeah, it'll be this common back and forth that we've been seeing over the last several weeks. So you can see here, this is snowfall, and you'll see these blue dots kind of indicate snowfall favoring the northern mountains as we get in Monday through Wednesday of next week. And anytime we get fresh snowfall, we're going to have these very short-lived, transient wind slab avalanche problems like we just showed in those previous videos. You're likely to find those wind-drifted pillows up high along ridge lines, and those will last a couple days, and then we get back into those warm, dry periods, and we will have wet avalanche concerns come back onto the radar. So as we move through the rest of the spring, we're going to oscillate between fresh concerns in the new and drifting snow, and then back to wet avalanche concerns. And many times those two avalanche flavors will exist at the same time, depending where you are in the terrain. And I do want to kind of just illustrate the seriousness of, some of the terrain people are pushing into. It's a great time to get out there and explore and tackle those objectives, which are generally not safe during more winter-like conditions. But this is an example from the Gore Range in this time of the year in 2020. And the reason I want to show it is because the conditions that year were really similar to right now. And this was a rider who was caught in a small wind slab avalanche up near the ridgeline here, and unfortunately was swept off his feet and washed down this steep couloir into rocky terrain and did not survive the injuries he sustained in the fall. So while most slopes are going to be safe from avalanches, you really want to consider, if you're pushing into steep, serious terrain like in this image, the consequences of even being swept off your feet. Otherwise, it's a great time to go out there and enjoy.
As we move into the month of May and the spring season, what can we expect, Brian?
We can expect this, back and forth between new wind-drifted snow and then loose, wet avalanche activity. And so the good news is, as conditions change, they get really predictable in the spring. You can start and end your day early. That will really reduce your risk from any threat from wet avalanche activity. And anytime we get new snowfall, check the forecast and look for that wind slab distribution, which is likely going to be confined to those higher elevations along the ridge lines. We kind of enter the month of May with, just under 100 people caught so far this year, 9 injured and 3 tragic fatalities so far this year. We don't want those numbers to increase at all. So please stay safe, choose objectives that are appropriate for the conditions, and please share your observations with us. We get observations start to dwindle as we move into May and people start looking at more springtime activities like riding their bikes or running. But if you're out there, please share what you see with us. It doesn't need to be an avalanche for it to be useful information.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brian. And the Colorado Avalanche Information Center will continue to produce their daily forecast through the end of May. But this is our final forecast for the season. So make sure to check the forecast with Brian and the Colorado Avalanche Information Center before you head back to the backcountry. And we will see you here next season for your first alert avalanche report.